right. Good afternoon. Thank you for watching this virtual lecture event. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. This event is part of the African Strategic Forum sponsored by the Institute of World Politics. I'll begin this afternoon's lecture by introducing our moderator and coordinator, Professor Hashim Mekki. Professor Mekki has taught Arabic language, culture, and Middle East media at IWP since 2012. He's the owner of Bridge Language Solutions, providing an array of language translation, interpretation, and teaching services to the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and the founder of Keeley Global, a nonprofit organization that promotes education, health, and economic empowerment in the Sudan and the Republic of South Sudan. He holds a bachelor's degree in both political science and international studies from the City College of New York and a Master of Arts in Strategic Studies and International Politics from IWP. I'd like to thank the panelists for joining us this evening, and without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Mekki.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for this kind and warm introduction. Hello, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for tuning in on Zoom, YouTube, and on Facebook. As Hannah has said, my name is Hashim Mekki, and I'm also the coordinator and moderator of the African Strategic Forum, which brings a deep understanding and address critical issues relating to governance, culture, development, private sector, and African politics. The forum invites leaders and independent thinkers and experts from broad interdisciplinary backgrounds for in-depth conversations on key topics. Our topic of discussion today is security sector reform in Sudan and the social transformation. We have 2 remarkable speakers who bring depths of expertise and knowledge on the security sector reform. Our presenters will explore how security sector reform can be implemented and democratic rule can take root in Sudan. They will discuss the possible pitfalls in the security sector reform processes and how democratic civilian movement can prevail in the Sudan. First, just a few housekeeping items before we start. I will first introduce the panel, and then I will also give them a few minutes to provide their remarks. And after that, I would ask them a couple questions to lead the discussion, and then I will open it up for Q&A from the audience. So please feel free to prepare your questions and don't shy away, and we would have a lovely discussion. Without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Linda Bishai and Dr. Sarah Desner. Dr. Linda Bishai is an adjunct professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs and research staff member on the Africa team at the Institute for Defense Analyses. Mr. Bishai has 20 years of experience in teaching, training, peacebuilding, and security sector reform. Dr. Bishai previously worked at the American Bar Association and at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She works on a wide range of international security issues, introducing African regional economic communities, security cooperation in Africa, and monitoring instability in Central and Southern Africa. She also delivered programs on preventing election violence in Sudan and South Sudan, civic education and higher education reform in Sudan, and women's role in preventing violent extremism in Nigeria and Kenya. Bishai holds a BA in History and Literature from Harvard University and a JD from Georgetown University Law Center, an LLM in International Law from the University of Stockholm, and a Ph.D. in International Relations from the London School of Economics. Now I will introduce Dr. Sarah Desner, who is a consultant based in Washington, D.C. Her research and consulting work on behalf of various governments, multilateral institutions, and think tanks and foundations is focused on security sector reform, particularly monitoring and evaluation, as well as the role of civil society and other forms of participation in post-conflict security sector reconstruction efforts. Previously, she served in the Obama administration as a speechwriter for for former Secretary of Defense Robert M. Gates, campaigned as an Obama 2008 staffer, and worked with the National Democratic Institute in Washington, D.C., Lebanon, and Jordan. She received her doctorate from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and is a fellow of the World Peace Foundation. So please join me in welcoming these two phenomenal experts on this topic of the day. So with that, and without further ado, I will let Dr. Linda Bishai bring us up to speed and give us an overview on this amazing topic of the day. So with that, please, Linda Bishai, can you go ahead?
Thank you very much, Hashem. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to you and IWP for hosting us and for approving of this interesting topic. It's been something on my mind for a very long time. And I'm sure many in the audience also are curious about what happens next for Sudan's security sector. I'm going to do my best to give a bit of an overview and kind of point the way with a few top level observations about where Sudan needs to go, what it needs to do to continue with its positive progress that it's made so far. And then I think Sarah, Dr. Desner will provide a nice deep dive into what the agreements are that came out of the Juba talks and what some of the details are for what's needed in a very technical security sector reform sense. So the thing that comes to mind when I look at where Sudan is now is that it's very much a mixed picture. I want to remind everyone who may be feeling overwhelmed by the extent of what Sudan still needs to do, that where Sudan has come and where it is now in comparison to 2 years ago is so phenomenally amazing that everyone should just jump for joy and clap their hands at least once, because Sudan has done so much and things that I never imagined it could have done when I first began to work on the country and travel to it and spend time there since 2005. So it really has made remarkable progress, and we need to remember that and celebrate it, and then put our heads to the task at hand. So when we look at what Sudan has done, almost every positive thing you can name has a but at the end of the phrase. So I'm going to go through a few of those so you get the idea of how I'm thinking about this. We have a civilian cabinet with lots of skilled technocrats in the Sudanese government, but they are sidelined by the greater authority and control that the military leadership in the Sovereign Council has, and we see that with General Burhan and Hameti taking their own bilateral relations and meetings with heads of state in other countries without bringing along the civilian cabinet. So that's a yes, but kind of scenario. We see that there are definitely positive efforts to rein in the unaccountable military investments, the control over the gold mines in Darfur. We saw that just this week. But there's no transparency about that process. And I don't think very many of us are very confident that this symbolic transfer of control to the civilian government really means that much, because it was too easy. I mean, no one expects that the military is going to just cede control of all of this wealth and all of these businesses. So the transparency is a major problem there. We've seen really significant legal reforms. The NCP has been disbanded, the public order laws have been ended, greater freedom for women, really remarkable legal transitions. But the judiciary remains the same judiciary, and it was not independent. It was appointed by Bashir, much more loyal to the former Islamist regime. And we have, I think, in my view, even more importantly, seen a real stalling and over-politicization of the Transitional Justice Commission and the transitional justice process, which I think is going to be crucial for security sector reform. We have seen the Juba peace deal make tremendous progress. We've seen signatures with most of the participants, but we've also seen it stall a little bit with the Nuba Mountains, and we've seen some of the Darfurian groups, and we've seen some problematic continuations of violence at the ethnic local level, right? You can sign a deal in Juba, but that doesn't mean that the people living on the ground are suddenly at peace with each other. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done to implement and make real the peace deal that was signed in Juba. And I think Sarah will tell us quite a bit more about that. We've seen U.S. normalize its relations to agree to an exchange of ambassadors, to delisting from the state sponsors of terrorism list, which is going to be a great opportunity economically. But we saw the U.S. unwisely, in my view, and as an aside, these are my views alone. I do not speak for the Institute for Defense Analyses. Forgot that little caveat at the beginning. But we've also seen the United States force a quid pro quo on Sudan for recognition of Israel and reestablishing relations with that. And although that would be a good goal, and I don't oppose it in theory, to put it as a quid pro quo for the SST delisting, in my view, was not a very wise move by the US leadership. And it compromises the Sudanese government and makes it all too obviously apparent that does not have the strength to resist that, and it makes it look weak. It weakens it, and it is also not necessarily a very strong position for Israel to take friendship offered under those circumstances. We have seen donors making promises. There have been several donor conferences, several billions have been promised, but the money is coming in very slowly, and the situation on the ground has been increasingly dire in a very rapid way, with the historic level floods, massive inflation, and rising food insecurity, all of this on top of the pandemic that we all feel. That's just a kind of a flyby view of some of the challenges and the achievements that we can see in Sudan today. Where does Sudan need to go to continue this transition and make sure to solidify the progress and keep it on its path? So I would argue that there are several areas. I'm not the first person to acknowledge we need an economic bailout for Sudan. It needs loan forgiveness. It needs entrepreneurship, cultivation of independent business sector, detached from the military. It needs to reinvigorate its education system and its judiciary with independence and codes of conduct and accountability mechanisms. It needs to strengthen, I think, above all, the governance connections between the local, state, and national levels. So one of the great news stories to come out of the revolution was the extent to which local level governance was filling the breach. Neighborhood committees, local organization, not elected for sure, but nonetheless extremely effective and accountable because it was so localized. And these committees and this local level governance, I think, is something that needs to be built on and not ignored and not sidelined by a formalized democratic process that says, hey, if you didn't run an election, you aren't a real part of our governance structure. I think we need to account for informal structures and knit them in as we build a more formal, accountable, and transparent democratic process at the higher levels. But above all, and this is what you all came for, above all, the military has to be reformed. For any of these to take root and to stick, the military has to be reformed. One of the things that really stuck in my mind in one of the first trips I took to Sudan was one of my Sudanese colleagues mentioned to me, and I looked in it, and it turns out this is absolutely true. The Sudanese military has never actually protected Sudan from external invaders or threats. It's always used, aside from the professional mercenarism that we're now seeing with some of the RSF troops and Darfurian militias. The Sudanese military, the uniformed professional military, has only ever fought itself inside, fought its own Sudanese fellows, fellow nationals in the Sudanese civil war with the South, fighting Darfur, fighting the East. I mean, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this phenomenon. That has got to change. What the military is essentially for has got to change. It needs to be professionalized. It needs to have an esprit de corps, a code of conduct and ethics, and an identity that says we are the Sudanese military. And by that, we mean for all of Sudan. Right now, the Sudanese identity for the armed forces is basically an ethnicized leadership cult, and that's been splintered into multiple leaders and multiple ethnically segregated cults. This is unsustainable, and it can result in some very impressive looking troop patrols and parades. It looks like it has great force using capacity, but in fact, it's quite dangerous, both for the country and for members of the armed forces themselves. To have fellow citizens who may in fact become their enemies on the turn of a dime when there's competition amongst the leadership is not a great way to live as a professional military. They should be redesigned to have an ethnic identity of Sudan writ large. And this is a long haul change. This does not happen overnight. This depends on cultivating a transformation in the society from top to bottom, teaching civic education in the schools, also changing entirely the whole pay incentive structure, the reliance on corruption, the reliance on the military having control over so many of the industries. So I'm going to plant those seeds. There's a lot more on my notes to talk about, but I see by my watch that I really don't want to step onto Sarah's time. So I'm going to leave it here and look forward to further questions and discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bishai, for your very informative remarks. Why don't you go ahead, Dr. Sarah Desner, provide remarks, please.
Sure. Dr. Bishai is an extremely tough act to follow. But I want to echo her on thanking you for setting this up and thanking the organization for really deep diving into this critical issue. So I'm not going to try to cover all of the same ground she did because she did it so capably. I am going to take a deeper dive into some of the structural issues and the political economy issues that have really gotten Sudan where it is now, but also possibly can get it to a better place. But I do want to start out by saying that there's a tendency in security sector reform as a field for people to be very familiar with their own region. And because of this, people can get a little bit depressed and pessimistic because in any given region, there's usually either no or one big success story. And if it doesn't look like your country, then you start to think it's not a doable proposition. So a lot of my work is a larger comparative lens. And I just want to say before we get into the details here that there are a lot of different ways to be a security sector reform success story. And by success story, I mean human security, actual security for ordinary people on the ground. So there are a lot of different ways, paths that Sudan can follow to get to where it needs to be, even if there are some obstacles. So with that little disclaimer, now that I've gone that positive note, I will say that I think that the current plans for SSR, as laid out in the various peace agreements, are not especially promising. This doesn't mean that they can't be built from, but it means that we need to recognize the gaps and build from there. I'm going to steal a line from Alex DeWall, who has commented that the tragedy of past Sudanese conflicts is that the negotiations devolved from how Sudan should be governed to who is going to govern it. In other words, a division of the spoils. And I think one of the really remarkable things about the recent revolution was the ability of people in the streets and all over Sudan to bring the focus back onto how Sudan is going to be governed. But I'm afraid that a little bit of that has been lost in the peace agreements, which are a little bit more of a division. The current structure of the agreements very much limits transparency and participation. What I mean by that is that the armed group leaders are being invited into back rooms, but the stager decisions are still being made in those back rooms. I'll get into this later, and I hope we talk about it more, but you can see this in all of the agreements in the structure of critical committees, which do not involve civil society representatives, do not have any sort of reporting structures. So that's something that we need to look at. There's also sort of a larger political and psychological change that needs to happen in that the old spoils system dependent on oil revenue is not coming back. Even if it weren't for the recent radical decarbonization, it's gone for good. And an attempt to restructure it without that sort of basis, without those spoils to distribute, is not going to end well. But part of the challenge now is to, first of all, come up with an alternate economic structure that can grow the pie, but also to get enough of the various factions that are on the fence, and by this I mean parts of the armed forces that would like for things to be different, and I mean people who have been involved in multiple rebellions over the years, to realize that things have in fact changed. And whatever is going to happen next will be different. So power sharing in Sudan means wealth sharing. This is very clear in most of the current agreements that cut the armed groups in on power in the regions through the mechanism of cutting them in on economic deals. You can see this very much in the level of detail in numerous agreements that is dedicated to who will control what natural resources and things like that, where, for instance, very few of the agreements spend more than a paragraph or two on policing, or on what exactly demobilization will look like other than integration into the armed forces. Now, there are multiple problems with this model. Something, and I think Linda really got at this, but I'm going to take it to brass tacks in economic terms. If these agreements were actually to go through, which in itself is a little dicey over the next 3 years, it would leave Sudan with a massive military that it absolutely cannot afford and more or less doesn't need. And this is a very tricky time while it's happening simultaneously with the desire to pull the military out of some of the economic roles that it has been playing. So all of the agreements have provisions for basically allowing any former combatants who choose it to be reintegrated into the military. As I said, that's going to create a huge structure that's not doing what Sudan needs done now in terms of the actual jobs, the infrastructure building, the entrepreneurship. So one thing that's going to have to be looked at in implementation is how to move away with that, with at the same time giving former combatants the confidence that if they give up that right to be reintegrated, that they will get something worth having that will let them build a new life. So further than that, and I think Linda really put the nail on the head when she talked about the blossoming of local governance and how important that's been. A lot of that is not reflected at all in the various agreements with different peripheral regions. There's no mechanism for ensuring local accountability during this multi-year transitional period. The assumption, unstated, is that the peripheral armed groups, of course, represent everybody within their territory. That's not realistic for any group anywhere, and obviously it's going to vary by group. So to set this up and say, representation in the new regional governments that we'll be setting up will give X seats to this armed group and Y seats to that armed group, that is nothing like democratization. And that is back to the old, who will rule different parts of Sudan rather than how will Sudan be ruled. So that's something that we need to look at very carefully. Picking up on another of Linda's threads with judicial reform, I think sometimes people neglect the critical economic role of judicial reform. Sudan is it's a ripe target for investment if the investment opportunity, or I should say, if the investment environment was there. And this has been clear over the years. Some of al-Bashir's great economic successes came when he was able to insulate external investors from judicial corruption. But of course, that was limited because it was a part of the system. So if the pie is going to grow, if Sudan is going to achieve the kind of economic success that it needs to have to escape these problems and to capitalize on this moment of opportunity, not only do you need judicial reform, you need judicial reform up and down the chain, specifically targeting anti-corruption, specifically targeting creating investment environments where people will feel confident developing, for instance, Sudan's horribly neglected agricultural potential. So obviously, the regularization of the relationship with the United States is a big opportunity, in that it takes away some of the immediate economic pressure. But it's an opportunity that could easily be lost if all of those funds that are freed up, if whatever debt relief program is agreed to just gets funneled into expanding an unsustainable military. And this moment won't come again. So that needs to be moved on fairly quickly. And it also touches on a larger issue, which I'm going to build on. As Linda said, making the deal with the United States conditional on recognizing Israel, while I too have no problem with the substance of that, the quid pro quo situation sent a very powerful message to the Sudanese people, which is what you want doesn't matter. And that is a very dangerous thing to say right now. And it's tied to the larger issue where the government of Sudan, as we see it, is obviously a collaboration between the military and civilians, where the military has almost all the actual power. But that doesn't mean that the military is going to take all of the blame. So what we see with deals like this is the delegitimization, people giving up on the idea that change is going to happen through these channels and giving up on their civilian government representatives because they're not able to deliver change. And they're not able to deliver change because they haven't been empowered to. And that needs to be brought out into the light by basically everyone involved. Donors, by the civilian government themselves. But this can't be something that isn't talked about. Because, the pro-reform coalition will splinter if there isn't an opportunity to bring it back together by talking about the relative power in these structures. So I want to take too long, but I will say there are some very practical issues that we're seeing in the agreements that unfortunately have been flaws in previous efforts that we're not seeing addressed. And one of them, to bring this back to an economic place, is the danger that the DDR process, as described, is going to create a giant arms market because of the requirement that people who are demobilizing turn in arms. Also, on a related note, we see that most of the demobilization language is focused around women and children. There is an implicit assumption in this language that women are not going to be part of the new Sudanese military. That's contradicted by things in some of the other agreements, but you can sort of see where the thinking really is when you dig into the details. So skipping ahead to what can and should be done, because I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. One of the things that is allowing all of this to happen is that pro-reform forces within the center and between the center and the peripheries do not have a common reform agenda. They haven't agreed on a few things that need to happen in the next couple of years, such that they can push for them and advocate to donors. Things like, and again, I'm tying this to what Linda had to say, okay, in this period of time, we are going to articulate the size and purpose of the military. We're going to discuss what roles it can legitimately play internally, and we're going to discuss who's going to take on the roles that are not filled. Another thing that you see in many of the agreements, as I mentioned before, is lack of civil society representation. And I want to highlight that that's at the local, regional, and national level. It's explicitly spelled out in these agreements who will be involved in various high levels committees making these decisions. And invariably, it is representatives of the armed groups, representatives of the government, and a few international representatives. That is not exactly inspiring from a participation standpoint. Now, I want to point out that there are homegrown solutions to this problem. The Eastern Agreement, for instance, is calling for a consultative process, a consultative conference of the peoples of Eastern Sudan. And I think not coincidentally, it's also the only agreement that calls for civil society representation. That kind of consultative process, going around and doing a security assessment, asking people what they think the role of the military should be, has been hugely successful in most other SSR success stories. And frankly, it's had success in a limited way in Sudan in the past, in Darfur in 2005. So there are ways to build on that if it's decided that that's something that needs to be a priority. And it's possible to hang that on the System of Governments Conference, which is supposed to happen in about 6 months, but we'll see. So just to wind it up here, to focus a little bit on the role of donors. Donors should not come in and be deciding what these priorities should be. That's the point of a consultative process. Even in much less complicated cases than Sudan, we will get it wrong. What donors can do is pick up on that reform agenda and push on the same issues. Take that knowledge and say, okay, we are also not going to pretend that the military and the civilian government are the same thing, and deal with them on those terms. We are going to demand a certain level of transparency as we work toward debt relief. We are going to condition some of the aid that we give on non-suppression of civil society, and particularly the media, on there being some form of public reports. One big thing that donors can do that's not covered enough, but we're seeing spilled over from South Sudan, is as Sudan opens up economically, this is going to be a big opportunity for exploitation by some of your more predatory foreign corporations. And given the problems that already exist with establishing land tenure, that is an extremely dangerous area. What donors can do is jump on this in the front end and say, okay, companies over which we have any leverage, if they're ours, if they're based in our territory, if they hope to do business, they are going to have to play by the rules. And we're going to establish publicly what those rules are. So having covered that ground, I'm going to pivot to questions, and or I should say, throw it back to Professor Mecki.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Desner, for your remarks. It's a lot of information, and certainly Linda also brought a lot of this remarks. So let's start with some questions, and then we'll open up for Q&A from the audience. So the first question is, following on what both of you have to say on this social transformation and security sector reform in the military. What do you think the role of, you alluded to the area of the donors. So what do you think the recent U.S. diplomatic influence in Sudan, brokering diplomatic relationship with Israel and beginning the process of lifting sanctions, will play as a role in the SSR processes? But also, what forms could or should the U.S. support in this regard?
All right, thank you, and I'll jump in before stepping aside for Sarah. I actually think that the quid pro quo scenario that we described is going to hurt the U.S. in the short term more than Sudan. And what I mean by that is it's going to cut into the already fairly positive view that Sudanese reformers had of the United States, and hoping the role that it, their hopes for the role it would play. And so I think that by showing that it was using Sudan, ultimately this is what it looks like, using Sudan as a pawn for its own greater Middle East peace process goals, this administration that is. I think that it in fact cut into the trust that Sudanese protest movement and reformers and civil society might have had. And that is a problem for the US, because it means that it has less leverage, less influence to use when it comes to actually promoting some of the positive incentives and some of the pressure for transparency that Sarah just described, with predatory corporations and investment, as well as with the way in which demobilization and security force integration happens. So I hope that there is, as that situation just sort of naturally resolves itself by happening and fading away from the news, and then we turn our attention to the actual work we have to do on Sudan. My hope is that the United States can, two things it can do. One is it has its own not insignificant resources to bring to bear to promote economic growth and and work on the economic side. It has quite a bit of civilian-oriented reform mechanisms. State and aid have a lot of foreign aid money at their disposal to apply, and are doing so in small ways at the moment. In terms of security sector, the U.S. has, its security assistance mechanisms are a little bit stiff, and there is actually quite a bit of interesting literature now urging for, and Secretary Esper, actually, Defense Secretary Esper, has recently made remarks about wanting to expand security cooperation with partners and allies. So Sudan has never been a partner for quite some time, but it has behind the scenes done some intelligence partnerships on counterterrorism, and I think that its transformation now actually makes it quite a good target for a very productive, hopefully well thought out and transparent recipient of security assistance. And at its best, this could mean starting from very low levels, with positive incentives in place for higher levels, greater cooperation, not just arms sales, but joint exercises. And above all, in my view, what would be really important is that professionalization that I spoke about in my opening remarks. That is, helping to work with the Sudanese military to inculcate those values of what being a professional soldier means, transforming that mission that they think they have from supporting their leader, who's an ethnic leader, to really being the military of the country, of the nation. That would be at its best. That's the ideal. I'm also aware that that's a difficult thing to do for the U.S. and its partners who also engage. The Europeans do some of this work as well. But that would be my hope, that there could be a coordinated effort to demonstrate in small and ever increasingly positive steps what the value for the military, for the rank and file. I mean, I think it's a much longer conversation and involves transitional justice to talk about what we do with the military leadership. That's a very sticky question. They have a whole different set of incentives than the rank and file soldiers do. But I think that actually the strength for external friends and partners, the best thing that they can do is add incentives to the military rank and file soldiers to understand what it might be like if they were professional soldiers. The second thing, and I'll make this quick, is that the United States and its European allies, but above all the United States, has quite a lot of leverage with the Gulf and regional neighbors who have been exerting quite a lot of not necessarily positive influence themselves, and have really just made it quite clear that they'd be happy to deal with only the military side of Sudan's current government, and aren't particularly interested in strengthening the democratic transition process. I think the United States can bring to bear certain amounts of pressure and persuasion to change that calculus. Even though these countries aren't so interested in a democratic process, they are interested in a stable Sudan. And if we can demonstrate that a transition to democracy will stabilize the country, then they could possibly make it a more productive engagement by the Gulf and neighboring states.
Sarah?
That was wonderful, and Linda covered a lot of the points I think needed to be covered, but getting into it a little, it kind of breaks my heart as someone who was in the DoD during some of our earlier efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think, again, we are engaging in really unjustifiable short-termism as the United States, and I'm talking in terms of our own interests. What I mean by this is that a stable Sudan, which I think it's fairly clear must be a democratic Sudan, at least to some extent, would be such an incredible boon for U.S. interests in the region. It would be such a powerful demonstration to Sudan's immediate neighbors. There is a way to make this transformation, and that this transformation can be made to pay. And this is particularly critical at a time when, as we talked about, natural resource rents are all over the place. People are trying to find a new way forward. So the power of that, especially with ongoing and frankly fairly dangerous regional disputes over the Nile waters, over other issues, a stable Sudan could do a lot for U.S. interests. The other alternative, and I don't think this has been thought about enough as we sort of rush to the finish line here, is what if these agreements go through as planned, and you have a Sudan with a giant, unaffordable military that it has no real use for? We're already seeing, and it has to pay for through mercenary activities. What we don't want in this region is a flood of cheap mercenaries. And you're already seeing some of this happening with the Sudanese forces being used as mercenaries in the Gulf and in Yemen and in other regional, mostly, to the detriment of both moral considerations and the United States' interests. There will only be more of that if that becomes, if the supply goes up, the demand will also go up. And to tie to what Linda was saying, this is a place that we have some leverage with our allies in the Gulf. We can say, okay, no, you can't do this. While we're trying to go through this process of security sector reform in Sudan, you can't be undermining it through this process. We probably won't be 100% successful, but we need to be thinking, as I said, of how directly this is in our own long-term interests. So I would build from that to say that if the United States is going to have red lines about providing certain types of assistance, that's not always a bad thing. Just because it was a bad thing with this recognition of Israel doesn't mean that it's always a bad idea, but the red lines could be very different. For one thing, we have done a poor job in the past, particularly in South Sudan, but also in Sudan, of conditioning our assistance on non-persecution of civil society and the media. We've allowed this to go on even as we've funded various SSR attempts, and that doesn't have to continue. That could be a change in our approach. And that's something that I think we get a lot of support. Donors are always more powerful than when they act together. That's something that there's a lot of support for in our British and European allies. Now, moving on from then, I agree that the US direct SSR system is a little bit creaky. And that this is something where civil society capacity building and funding consultations and protecting those kind of meetings is something that desperately needs to happen. It's something that's relatively affordable, and it's something that's not really the Department of Defense's wheelhouse. So that's Sudan in some ways can be an example of a larger pivot that we're trying to make. But within that, when we start to get to the point of training and equipping, which is always where we're more comfortable, there is good examples from previous cases that being sort of let back into the realm of respectable militaries is an extremely powerful inducement for middle and lower ranks. Again, the very highest ranks is a different story, but we've seen it in numerous other cases. Right here, I'm just going to highlight, this was from several decades ago, but Ghana and Senegal, who went through security sector reform processes. And part of what allowed these processes to stick was the incorporation of their militaries into peacekeeping missions further down the line. Obviously, Sudan is a far away from that, but the idea that that's something that could happen, that the Sudanese military could have an identity and a level of professionalization, and not have to engage in a degree of politicking and corruption that frankly must be exhausting for many of the people involved. That's a thing to hold out there, and that's something that we can use sort of our DoD training and equipment inducements to build on. So I'll just stop there.
Actually, I want to quickly have a follow-on point to add to Sarah's, which is mentioning the capacity building with civil society. Totally agree. And I think that it's important for us to see that the role civil society can play vis-a-vis security sector reform it's watchdog for sure. Civil society can hold the military or armed forces accountable. They can fact find, they can make public and keep eyes on processes and all of that good watchdog work. But I think it's important to not forget that they can also be advocates for what the military needs with the hopefully soon to be effective legislature, right? So fast forward a little bit, imagine Sudan having finally creaky, to use a good word, legislative process in place that starts to allocate funding and pay attention to other reform processes. And civil society can be an advocate for veterans, can be an advocate for current active duty forces, and they can play the role both ways. They're different organizations can specialize with different sets of emphasis. And I think all too often in countries where we work closely or hold up the role that civil society can play, we only see them as watchdogs and interested in blaming government or military for getting it wrong. Civil society has a very important advocacy role to play that supports the government and supports these transformation processes. And I think that's important to remember.
I agree with you, Dr. Bishai and Sarah, for sure, that civil society need to be empowered. And given that in this case of Sudan, because the former president Omar al-Bashir, because we're talking about Sudan, that is, I like the models that have been cited as Ghana and Senegal. However, Sudan had not had a vibrant civil society due to the former president Omar al-Bashir. Now, Sudan, as we've all known, that is going through this transformation. Now, how can you empower that civil society so that it can act as an advocate in these processes that we're talking about? Linda, and then Sarah.
Well, I'm actually going to politely somewhat disagree with you on
Sure.
Sudan civil society not being very strong.
Sure.
It was disempowered, but it was there,
Sure.
right, waiting to be strong. And I think that if Sudan didn't have civil society, we couldn't have seen the protests grow to the extent and be nationwide the way they were. So I think that process of organizing for the protests, organizing for the length and strength of that revolutionary movement really breathed some air into people who, there were these little tiny 1-person, 2-person, 3-person civil society organizations during the Bashir years. They were there. They just, and I used to remember, I mean, when I did this work, trying to strengthen civil society, I remember very well that it used to be an axiom that if they had nice computers and an office, then they were government affiliated civil society, because of course the Bashir regime created its own pocket civil society organizations to funnel all the foreign funding.
Right.
And we learned to discriminate. And if it was some guy, who wore the same suit every day and worked out of his garage or didn't have an office, then he was the real guy you wanted to work with, right? He was the real civil society. So it was there. It has always been there.
Yes.
Now, and that's a good thing. What I'm saying is, even though it hasn't been so visible or empowered, it was there. And now that means that what we need to do is just take it by the hand and work with it, lift it up, walk with it. And that will mean more than just saying, okay, great, civil society, here you are, this is the role you need to play. It also means doing our best to bring them up to their own management standards, right? So there's, and not just in Sudan, but across the continent and in many lesser developed or less wealthy countries, their civil society is not practiced in account keeping, in report writing. They're deeply well informed and connected. They understand what's happening in their country, but they don't necessarily know how to write advocacy reports for international consumption. They don't know how to keep their own accounts clean so that they don't look like they're corrupt. So civil society needs to be transparent as it tries to hold the government transparent. And this is something we need to actually build the capacity of civil society organizations to manage themselves as well, like just basic office skills, as well as being able to work with their watchdog and transparency. Indeed,
that's very insightful. That the civil society need to be propped up and trained and build build their capacity. So, Sarah, please.
Yeah, if I could jump in here, I agree with a lot of what Linda had to say, particularly about the actual strength of Sudanese civil society. But I actually have a slightly different take in terms of what support can look like. And also, first of all, I think we need to take a very expansive view of what counts as civil society in a country that's as large and as Sudan. It's not even just limited to some of the organizations we're talking about, even if it's some guy in his garage. a local tribal leader is a civil society member, at least for the moment. You know, they're not officially a member of government, but they have an incredible amount of role. They're providing security and justice services. One thing that donors shouldn't do, and don't have to do, frankly, is pick winners. This is part of the reason that I think consultation is so powerful. And I want to say that when I mean consultation, I mean that donors can support members of Sudanese civil society writ large in the regions, meeting with each other and setting up an agenda and saying, okay, what do we think is important here, instead of being told. And that can also happen between regions, and it can happen between regions and the capitals. And all of those conversations, what you see in other cases is that coalitions and shared agendas tend to come out of those things by themselves. Donors don't need to go in and set them, as long as people are empowered and safe to talk to each other. That doesn't mean that donors can't help. You know, particularly I'm familiar in some processes. I'm thinking of recent developments in Gambia right now, where donors have gone in and basically facilitated strategic planning processes for large groups of different civil society actors. Again, not saying this is what your agenda will be, but here's a process by which you could achieve a joint agenda. So I definitely think that there's a lot that can be done, but it needs to break with the previous mold. It needs to always be thinking in terms of how do we help people talk to each other and set their own agenda, not how can we decide whose voice needs to be heard here.
Very, very insightful points that people need to be at the table. And I would definitely agree that at this juncture, because of the post-revolution environment, people are speaking up more. I mean, friends I talk to on the grounds, they're often in consultation with the council members, but also with others. So they're you know, to your point and Linda's point, the Sudanese civil society have been very vibrant. It's just that in the past they've been curtailed. Now they're opening up, and they're being allowed to express their views. There's just many of these groups, like you've said, from region to, you know, definitely in the Nuba Mountains, Blue Nile, Darfur areas, and you mentioned that Bija. They're all on YouTube and talking about wanting their rights. So I do absolutely agree that the civil society, as Linda has said, need to be maybe more training on how to advocate for the things and how to be on the table and ask the right questions and be a part of this strategic planning. So I do agree with that. Now, the other question is, how do these processes of SSR in Sudan affecting neighboring countries? Let's say South Sudan. And as we know, the peace negotiations that just happened in Al-Hilo's group and Abdul Wahid's group, they still have to follow through so that they could be brought into the overall peace agreement, so that it could be more comprehensive. But how does this processes help Sudan, but also how does it impact South Sudan? Linda, sorry.
Yeah. Thanks. You know, that's a really good question, and I think much remains to be seen. I was in South Sudan for the referendum on independence, and I remember the euphoria of South Sudan when it gained independence. And I also remember that the Northern Sudanese felt there's a very strong sentiment of sadness, but also, well, you go show us how to do it, so we can have at least one Sudan that's a good democratic country. And that was a very strong point of view in the North in 2011 and 2012. And sadly, that is not how it worked out. And so I wonder if there isn't now a kind of a boomerang back into the court of the North, and an opportunity for the North to demonstrate a very positive model. Now, not obviously going to be difficult. That doesn't mean it gets it all right, but rather that effort, a continued, sustained effort to be inclusive and transparent and accountable, and to stick with it, to keep at it. Democracy isn't something you just arrive at and sit down and rest. You never get there. You constantly work at it, and you constantly correct, and constantly watch, and constantly respond. And For Sudan to now have that role of having to demonstrate what it looks like, I think I think to answer your question in a very short way, it could have a tremendous impact on the South. I am not optimistic in the short term. I think it will take quite some time for that positive impact to manifest. I think South Sudan is in very deep structural crisis, actually, and that's another panel.
Yes, we would definitely set up another time for further discussion on this. Dr. Desner, if you can also add to this, if you can.
Keep it brief because I think Linda's expertise in this particular area is much greater than mine.
Sure.
But I will say that having looked at issues of SSR in South Sudan, we're dealing with most of the same things. And I should say, particularly in a political economy perspective, the ways of operating, the ways of making deals, who gets included and excluded, the politicians and armed group leaders of the South learned this in the, back when Sudan was one country. The models are the same. And so because of that, there's just such potential if things can change in the North, if a lot of these problems can be resolved, then it's not going to be a one-for-one, but there'll be a lot to be learned for how real security sector reform can happen in the South.
Okay, great points. Now let's pivot to the questions from the audience on Facebook and YouTube and Zoom. So Al-Mamoun Sulfab asked that what's the current relationship between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Defense Force? Why don't you take that, Linda?
Thanks. Well, I'm sure there are people who have a much closer in view that could be more nuanced and detailed. But my quick answer to that question is they're frenemies. They are in competition with each other. They have some overlap of interests, not least of which is to maintain some of their graft that they are currently able to control. They don't want to give up completely. I do suspect, however, that there is a dawning sense of realism about the inability of the forces, both the SAF and the SRF, to have things just as they were. I think that is dawning on people. Okay. So the real question is what comes next? And I do think it'll be quite important to back up and be more direct to the question. The SAF and the SRF are led by two different leaders with two different ideas of what success looks like. And I think that discussion of integration of forces, which is nominally accepted and agreed upon, is another one of those processes that, as Sarah describes, there's an awful lot of, who gets to do it as opposed to what it actually is. And that's definitely happened with talking about force integration between the SRF and the SAF, the RSF and the SAF. And I think that I don't have a good, quick, here's the best way to do this kind of answer for that question. But I do think that the role of outside actors and the role of reformers must be on process. The process must be transparent and inclusive and accountable. We need to know what they're deciding, who's deciding it, how it's going to be monitored as it moves forward towards the achievement of the stated goal. And it needs to be an inclusive process that accounts for the effect that this ultimate integration and reform will have on all of the people up and down the chain, all the way down into local communities and neighborhoods. But yeah, that's the relationship between the RSF and the SAF is probably the single biggest security forces question.
Sarah, having followed this closely, what's your read on this?
Well, I'll jump in for just a second. I don't know if I followed it closely in this, but I will say that, again, applying the lessons of other efforts, it's all about who has the bigger coalition that manages to stay united for longer, pro-reform or anti-reform forces. And so if the RSF and the SAF stay united, in an anti-reform direction, I don't think reform is going to happen. But I don't think that they are united, because I don't think that they actually have the same interests. And this I'm going to get to Linda's frenemy. And I think that one of the strongest things that both externals and internals pro-reformers can do is highlight the fact that the RSF and the SAF don't have the same interests. You know, I think that the SAF has a lot more of an interest in becoming the kind of professional military that we picture. They have more experience with it. That's more of their institutional culture. And you know, again, you have to rely on reports, but I think there's more of an interest there. And the RSF has never really been that. And this isn't to say that there's no working with the RSF and it should be, you know, cast into the darkness. But part of these conversations that need to be had, as Linda said, the process is very important in public as much as possible, is to talk about who is going to do what are the roles moving forward, and specifically, what does this mean for what will happen for people at the highest level, what will happen to people at the middle rank, and what will happen for people at the bottom. I'm leaving out the integration issue for the moment because that's a whole nother kettle of fish. But I think that the process of having those conversations in public will make these contradictions much clearer. Part of the problem in past efforts has been that these things all happen behind closed doors, and then leaders come out and say, trust me, I'm taking care of you. And that's where the pushback can happen.
Indeed. William Kalima asks the questions of what should the international community and the US government do to reduce conflict in the region and help the Nuba Mountains? I guess Sarah just spoke, so maybe Linda, how are you?
I think the fact that the conflict is continuing despite the very the Nuba Mountains leadership is quite close to joining the Juba agreements, I think speaks to Sarah's comment about how these leaders only represent interest in the broadest possible sense and are not necessarily able to completely control or speak for their entire regions. And I think that what the U.S. can do is to make sure that it makes clear that it sees what's happening and hold the Sudan current integrated government accountable for that continued violence, right? It is not the role of the United States to get in there and stop the violence in the Nuba Mountains, but it is their role, US and its allies and friends of Sudan. It is our role to say, you guys haven't fixed it. Get back in there and fix it. And what we mean by fix it is, you know, make sure that you have accounted for all the different local groups and interests, and don't just fix it at the high level by getting Abdulaziz Al-Hilu to sign a piece of paper. That's not fixing it, right? As important as he is, and you know, and that's not an insignificant achievement. It doesn't mean that conflict just goes away. Conflict has been built up for the 30 years of the Bashir regime. It doesn't go away overnight because suddenly the government says, great, we're all friends now. You have all those people at the local levels who aren't friends and who have been incentivized to fight. So I think a good part of it is you know, pressure, pushing on transparency, keeping it visible, keeping it in the public eye, but also paying attention to what the root causes are. So we've said a little bit about you know, the changing economic landscape, and there's no oil anymore, or even if there were, oil is not really the great commodity it used to be. There's the water argument going on, in which Sudan is pulled in the middle between Egypt and Ethiopia. There are land rights issues. There are the nomadic and the farmer and the herder, you know, issues that have plagued Sudan for much of its history, and they're only exacerbated. They've been politicized and made worse. These are issues that can be resolved if people don't feel like their very lives are threatened. And that is what the Bashir regime did for 30 years. It pushed the disagreements and conflicts into existential ones and made them seem like they were the most important thing that anyone could ever be involved in. If I don't, if I survive, you die. If you survive, I die. We've got to get rid of that, because the truth is Sudan has enough wealth for everybody. And that big pie just needs to be shown to everyone, and their role in it needs to be shown.
Indeed. So the pie has to be shared. I mean, you alluded to Abdulaziz Al-Hilo's upcoming meetings in Juba to resume peace negotiations. So on the other hand, you also have Abdul Wahid, whose group also, they have presence in Darfur. So which indicates, like you said, this root causes, unless these other opposition groups are brought into the peace negotiation processes, and of course, having the civil society also present, this peace processes and root causes might not be addressed. Sarah?
I think Linda really covered the specific situation, but I do want to highlight that sort of some of the things that we're seeing in the Nuba Mountains because of these agreements. When we push for participation and consultation, it's not just because it's nice and it's what people deserve. It's because it's the only way to build real stability. And particularly the model in Sudan in the past has been that, so if the armed groups have pretty much unchecked power in the regions, as is played out in some of the agreements, over a course of years, some of them will handle it well and some of them will handle it badly. And there won't be accountability checks as currently written, unless there's some attempt to build up local and regional government. And what will happen in that case is that unhappy people within these spheres of influence will rebel. You'll see the same kind of splitting of groups who have different interests. You'll see, I would expect, an explosion of violence within various regions. And that is the real reason to focus on cutting that off at the pass now. Because we don't want to see this pattern. If violence becomes fractal like that, then the next peace process is going to be even harder.
I think you alluded to something very important, which is the groups that operate within the regions, and certainly that has been under this current transitional government. There has been instances from both Sudan, certainly with the Bija you alluded to earlier, with Beni Amir and the Nubas having tensions, but also in places like a Jinena in a Darfur, where a group of armed men would just go and ransack an entire village and burn it to the ground, and other places. So this has been, there have been instances like that under this current administration, and so it begs the question: well, who are the people who are behind this? Are this the old guard who are just not going, off the radar quietly? And there's certain elements of that security need to be checked, maybe better policing and maybe reform, like we've said in this topic. So, but you also have the political parties' influence in the regions. So, for instance, in the Nuba Mountains, there have been appointments of certain governors. So some governors who have been appointed have been rejected by the people. Some have been accepted. So it depends on how this reform efforts goes and how that consultation with the people takes place. And I do agree that if we have people being consulted and they agree that so and so have to represent them, then maybe that ought to be respected. And this is definitely a dynamic that is being played on and is ongoing right now. So great point. Second question from Ismail Kushkush is: what evidence is there of regional actors funding the military / RSF intelligence, within this transitional government? Linda?
I'm not entirely sure. The question is, what is the evidence of foreign militaries funding the RSF? What was
the regional actors? The question is regional actors funding the military intelligence within the transitional government. I'm not really sure, but let's say let's say, I think the thing within the Sudan debate right now is UAE role, Egyptians' role, Saudi roles within, the actors, and then of course we have IGAD, Eastern African Economic Bloc, but also the African Union. I believe this is what the questioner Ismail Kushkish is alluding to.
Well, there have certainly been a number of reports in a year ago during the run up to the actual final agreement, and right around the June 3rd massacre time, when there were reports coming out, and these are reports where, this is the kind of thing where you can't exactly, you're not going to footnote it to an official person admitting it. It's the kind of thing where I had a conversation with a high-level government official. So these are the kinds of sources, and they're not named, but you have to just trust them based on who is telling you that they said it. And there are a number of, I think, fairly reliable accounts of high-level support from the Gulf, from the UAE, from Saudi Arabia, Qatar being sidelined by that interest, but there in the background, having previously supported the Bashir regime. But basically high-level interest, Egypt, of course, as well, with the military side of the conversation being, so the negotiations happening between Burhan and Hemeti and the FFC. And I think that there's no evidence that that support, and it's been both financial and moral, if you will. So put scare quotes around the word moral there. That kind of support for the military side of the government. There's no evidence that that has changed and that there is now Gulf support for the civilian side, right? When you see Burhan flying to, and you see Hemeti flying to Doha, flying to Riyadh, flying to Abu Dhabi, and having conversations. He's also flying to, they're taking meetings with very high-level bilateral governments without the presence of Hamdok, without the foreign minister. This tells you, you can connect the dots behind the scene. You can dig and find some evidence from reports about whether money changed hands. I'm fairly sure some did, where that money goes. Because of Sudan's military non-transparency, the fact that they're trying to hide the corruption that funds them, it would be extremely difficult to actually uncover where the money goes and how it's spent. But that is part of what the transformation process needs to do. It needs to make it impossible for other governments to only support the military. The support to the Sudanese military should go through the transparent Ministry of Finance so that we can see it and we know what it's spent on and who ultimately gets it. So that the very fact that you can't find evidence for support is the problem. That support needs to be absolutely transparent, and that's how you know you're going to have reform.
So the next question is, Linda Schellenberg asks, do you think the renewed relationship between Sudan and Israel will hold if there is a new administration in the United States?
I doubt that. I doubt that very much, but and I don't want to monopolize that because I think Sarah has views on this too. But for me, I don't think any U.S. leader would say it's a terrible idea for Sudan and Israel to be friends. I think what is likely to happen is that without a hard push, if there's a bit of a backing off, they could be friends the way Egypt and Israel are friends. And Egypt and Israel have been friends for a long time, and they're really not friends. And that was my earlier point about how it's not necessarily a good thing for Israel to have this normalization, because normalization is a box-checking exercise. It doesn't mean the nations are friends. It doesn't mean that Sudan is going to, it means that you can buy Sudan's friendship, let's put it that way, in an instrumental way. And that is, I'm not criticizing the government for having to do that. It is absolutely with its back against the wall here. They need to make this choice. They don't have a lot of options. I don't see that they're making it and will withdraw it right away and go back to status quo ante. I don't think that'll happen. But what I do think will happen is that the friendship will be skin deep. And that the ball is really in Israel's court to show Sudan that it's worth being friends with. that there's a value to it. It's not just that the U.S. is making it happen.
Sarah?
To speak a little less directly, but sort of combine this and the previous question. I don't know. So I know they don't seem obviously connected, but in general, part of the value of a more transparent process and having all these conversations in public is there's a lot of countries that are very obviously using Sudan for their own purposes right now. And that's okay. That's what countries do. I don't mean it's okay in a larger sense, but it's about what can be expected. And part of that's possible because of the division and the fact that there's a lack of established processes. We know that some of the money that's coming from the use of certain Sudanese military, Sudanese mercenaries, is making its way to various parts of the military. And that's changing the power balance. And, that is only possible because of this kind of lack of transparency. I think that if things succeed, as Sudan stabilizes, as democratic structures become more established, I would expect to see sort of growing outrage among, which already exists on a lower level, but I think will just be articulated more from Sudanese citizens for how all of this has happened and continues to happen. And at that point, and I could be talking about Israel, I could be talking about Saudi, the UAE, but if we get to that point, I don't think it will be a good idea to be still in the position to be the recipient of all of that anger. Now is the time to build more genuinely reciprocal relationships with Sudan, because things will change.
Great inputs. This is from an anonymous attendee. So he or she says, years of oppressive regimes in Sudan and anti-intellectual by al-Bashir rule of the skilled and professional Sudanese have been displaced and gone to other countries. How should the interim government tap into those who have become economic immigrants or who have lived abroad? How would the current government tap into that so that they can help in the reform processes?
That's a really good question and a really important observation, that Sudan has a wealthy and educated diaspora class. We're privileged to be moderated by one of them right now. So this is kind of a great question about how do you use your diaspora. It's a tricky question, because the diaspora was extremely active in supporting and amplifying the revolution as it happened in real time. Now that there's a kind of a distance now that the transformation process is sort of happening in the country, and what does everyone out of the country do? And having your Twitter and Facebook accounts isn't necessarily as directly active as it was during the sit-ins, and when making news was really part of the effort. I think that there are. I think that making the economic environment, the judicial reform that was mentioned earlier, conducive to investment is one way, and I think Sudanese investors will be the first to jump back in. There's a question about whether you want them to stay abroad or you want to lure them back, and I'm not sure what the Sudanese government's thinking is on this one entirely, but I do think that what you want to do is make the Sudanese diaspora feel invested in Sudan's success. The way to do that is to openly engage them through the embassies, and to be open to their involvement when they tap you and ask. I think that it's important for those who are still in the country and who may feel that they bore the burden of the demonstrations and the protests, to not feel. I think there's a risk, is what I mean to say, that if the diaspora's talents are overly appreciated or seen to be overly appreciated, that there could be resentment by those who had to suffer through in country. That's my point. And I think that that's sort of a natural risk every time you have this kind of social transformation where there's a diaspora involved, that the diaspora needs to have a defined, clear, and transparent role, rather than being seen to suddenly, because they left the country and got rich, suddenly have all the power. You need to not be seen to be too responsive to the diaspora for your domestic audience. But the diaspora is there, and it's powerful and talented and should be used. So I think that some creative mechanisms, forming regular contact, hearing ideas from the Sudanese abroad, asking them how they want to help, what they feel able to do to help, keeping them in the loop, but managing that process mindfully, to not rely on them in a way that makes it sound like the value of the actual Sudanese citizens who were part of the revolutionary process themselves is being marginalized. I know that's a convoluted answer, but I do feel that risk is real, and it's happened in other places.
Very good, very good. Sarah?
I'm going to supplement this with an incredibly narrow response, because Linda captured so much. And that's because I can't speak to any other politics but the United States. But early in my career, I did a lot of work with political organizing work with various diaspora communities in the United States as part of US politics. And I should say that influential diaspora communities are united diaspora communities. And even though there aren't that many Sudanese in the United States, there are enough, and in certain places. You can see there's always a tension between, are we going to spend our time and energy focusing on issues back home, or are we going to spend our time and energy sort of advocating for, the way that we would like policy to be within the United States? And I would, they're both important, but I would perhaps emphasize a little bit more on the second, because the United States has made a lot of decisions about Sudan from a place of ignorance, and from a place of being pulled in different directions. And a united diaspora community that is sending a clear message about what needs to happen next can actually be pretty politically influential in this immigrant country of ours.
Great insights, and that's why we're here to bring knowledge to the public so that they could be educated, and then once they are, maybe they will be making informed decisions, be it foreign policy or otherwise, vis-a-vis Sudan. With regard to Linda's point, I believe you're spot on in terms of the diaspora role, in the current transition, and by and large, they have played a huge role. They have also they've been engaged by the current administration, at least from the Sudanese prime minister have gone abroad, and his cabinet also tried to do this outreach. But I certainly do agree that perhaps they could do, I wouldn't say more to that, since you put it very well. Now let's pivot to an issue of, so the question I have here is, what role, or how would the broad participation of women and their participation in the leadership and democratization processes influence this current administration but also going forward, particularly with the security sector reform in the Sudan?
Well, I just have two observations on that question.
Sure.
One is the statistics are totally in favor of the greater number of women, the more likely the success of transformation processes, of peace processes, also of the use of the military. When women are in the military and in the police, their ability to cultivate and provide security is maximized. So numbers are there, studies have been done. Go read and believe. In terms of what this government is doing, or what the security sector reform prospects look like, I would just go back to the earlier observation that Sarah made, that there doesn't seem to be an expectation that women will be in the military, and say we need to put that to bed as quickly as we can, and to say all modern professional militaries understand and appreciate and include women. And if you want to join the ranks of professional militaries and provide that, that role of being in the African Rapid response troops or being in UN peacekeeping missions that we mentioned earlier, that would be bolster both your incomes, but also your prestige and your role in the world. You need to incorporate women into your ranks and understand why. There's a there's a great history in Sudan of box checking with women, and they round up the nearest women in the family and put them on the ballot and say we have met our
Quota.
our quota, and then those women can only vote the way their husbands tell them to. That's not what we mean. We mean the capacity of women needs to be used, and Sudanese women also have a strong history of being organized, educated, and capable, and so they are a resource that the country needs and should use.
Great. I certainly agree that the woman participation. I mean, they were pivotal during the revolution. So it's like an iconic picture of Allah, who's the woman who's on the top of the car. So this picture just went viral, and it does show that women have contributed greatly to the success of removing Omar al-Bashir from power. And the current Minister of Justice, I believe he has passed some reform laws that gives women more right. I mean, and Sudan, having been ruled under Sharia law, women were not allowed to. I mean, dress code was strictly imposed, and alcohol being brewed and things like that. So there have been some successes in terms of laws passed that give to women this what benefits, but definitely there's more room for improvement in that regard. On that same topic, I mean, you both are experts on this transitional and social transformation, but countries certainly in the form of Sudan, or countries that are like Sudan, who have emerged from a conflict and a civil war. We're talking specifically about the IDPs in Darfur, Nuba Mountains, Blue Nile, and the huge chunk of this are women who have who have basically suffered and being raped and whatnot, and their loved one being taken away from them. So we're still talking about transitional justice, the family members that have not been accounted for or have been victimized by the former regime have not. So what would you two say to that? I mean, what is the best way of addressing this transitional justice issues for the victims, especially in Darfur, Nuba Mountain, in these areas, but also how do you just account for compensating them so that they can safely return and so that they can start their lives over?
Well, if I could jump in for a second to
Yes,
just
please.
combine these two, I think Linda might have more to say specifically about
Absolutely.
transitional justice. But two things are true simultaneously, and one of those is that women were disproportionately victims. But it's also true that it's dangerous to paint women exclusively as victims and sort of put them in that space. And I think one of the things that distinguishes successful and non-token inclusion of women from just that old tokenism is to look at the roles that women are already playing and figure out how to recognize and formalize those. And I mean, I've seen this in multiple different things. So it's not just Sudan, but you see cases, and this is definitely true in Sudan, where women have served as combatants in various armed groups. And this is conveniently forgotten because it's a narrative that people don't want to think about. And so they're basically told to go home at the end of it instead of sort of, focusing on that as a reintegration priority, people who already have some of this experience. And also, and this takes us a little closer to transitional justice, in the security vacuum that many parts of Sudan have been experiencing all this time, women have stepped up as non-formal providers of justice, probably more than security, but also providing social services, that kind of thing. And there's a risk, as there have been in other efforts, that as things formalize, it'll be like, okay, thank you for doing that. Now we're going to go back to the previous model, which never worked that well to begin with. So there's a need to pay a lot of attention all over, but yes, primarily in areas where there's a lot of IDPs, to what is working right now. what are women already doing and how can they be supported because they understand what they need the best.
Linda.
On the technicalities of the function or process of transitional justice, there are lots of models, and it's not one size fits all. I think there needs to be, the government needs to bite the bullet and stop pretending that they can just delay down the road until it goes away and people forget about it. They're never going to forget about it. It's absolutely crucial that a process happens and that it be as extensive and inclusive as possible, meaning that it covers as many conflicts and as many abuses as it can, and allows the voices, the stories to be told, and the record to be written of what happened. And so, I understand, of course, that the security forces have a very strong interest in not having that record come out. And so but Sudan isn't the first time or the first country to have this problem and to go through this process. There are many models available where there is forgiveness, there is amnesty, there is simply telling the story but not making it a legal process. Probably the international gold standard would be to find a local way that suits your culture and suits the needs of local communities, while identifying a certain top level leadership that doesn't get let off, right? So you sort of slice the leadership and those who gave the overarching orders that made the abuses happen, and then the lower level rank and file abusers are simply recorded. But there's plenty of leeway. You can have all kinds of community service action. You can have it's basically a menu that can be tailor-made to suit. Now, the question is, how do you find out what the Sudanese will be happy with? And it may look different in all the different regions. Sudan's transitional justice process may need to be one for every state of Darfur, one for the Nuba Mountains, one for Blue Nile, one for the East, one for the continuingly simmering process in Abyei and the North. And Sudan, Khartoum itself. Let's not forget that Khartoum itself saw tremendous abuses. And so I think that, again, that's one of the things the international community can keep doing, can keep saying, you're forgetting about transitional justice. Let's not do that, and provide positive incentives. We're going to unlock this fund of assistance if we see that your commission is beginning and meeting and starting to come up with plans. And again, there's plenty of transitional justice expertise in international partners and organizations. We're waiting to share. Sudan is not alone in coming up with how it's going to deal with this. There will be support, but it has to lead the process. It has to be a homegrown process.
Perfect. Well, this is really lively discussion, and we definitely need more time. And we're coming to the end of our panel discussion, which is very energetic. I could go on and on. There's still more questions to be asked, but we don't have time. But I'm so grateful that we've had this opportunity to talk Sudan security reform and the way forward. So thank you so much, Dr. Linda Bishai and Dr. Sarah Desner, for this very lively, energetic, and very informative. I hope it benefits the people of Sudan, and we see a progress in that country. So I really honored to have moderated this event and participated in it.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And thank you to our audience for bringing their questions. It has been a great discussion. So thank you, and have a good evening and good night wherever you are. And I look forward to seeing you in future African Strategic Forum webinars. So thank you.